important point you made is that there is this strong divergent trend, that you've got the US and its allies going in one direction, and you've got essentially the rest of the world going in the other direction. And one real negative in all of this is, like, if we take the US position as a given, if we say, okay, the US has got its policy, the US wants to maintain its dominance, it wants to maintain the imperialist world system based around, on the one hand, on the financial side, dollar hegemony, and on the military side, well, its whole network of 800 foreign military bases, is bilateral relations with any number of countries, well, like any number of different national armies, its naval exercise and all the rest of it. That that's a given. We know where the US is at, and that's not really very likely to change. The US imperialist strategy, frankly, isn't going to change until the rest of the world forces it to change. What has been a little bit more up in the air in recent years, especially since the collapse of the Soviet Union, so throughout the 90s and then particularly in the noughties, is what is the position of Europe in all of this? And I think, Donald Trump would have dearly loved to have really consolidated this US-led imperialist alliance with Europe coming fully on board. And he wasn't entirely successful with that. And Biden thus far has been a lot more successful. And there's a few reasons for that. One, obviously, the Ukraine crisis is a very important variable. The change of government in Germany is something that we don't speak about enough, and which is also important because, Merkel, for all her faults, she was essentially a ruthless imperialist politician, but also she did have some sense of the kind of inevitable nature of a multipolar future, and she did have some sense of the need to have some kind of balance, with Europe in the middle, Russia and China on one side, the US on the other side. And Merkel, she was part of the CDU, which is by no means a progressive organization, but she grew up in East Germany. She speaks fluent Russian, and she was just, the whole aspect of the whole outlook of German foreign policy under Merkel was, I would argue, significantly different to what you've got now with the Scholz government, which in paper, in theory at least, should be somewhat more progressive, being an alliance of the Social Democrats and the Greens. But actually, they're essentially, and unfortunately, we're seeing the same now with New Zealand as well, and the putatively progressive and social democratic Jacinda Ardern essentially reading off the script that's been printed for them in Washington. And I mean, the German Greens have got a pretty horrific record of supporting whatever imperialist madness is on the table. But that's another discussion. But what we are seeing is a consolidation of the imperialist bloc, which is essentially a negative development. Like, the US has been able to persuade its European allies and its Anglo-Saxon allies, Britain, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, to impose unprecedented sanctions on Belarus, unprecedented sanctions on Russia, to ramp up their contributions to NATO. You've got Sweden and Finland seemingly on the verge of joining NATO, breaking what has been a very successful and a perfectly sensible policy of neutrality that they've held for the last 70 years. And all of this is coming at massive cost to ordinary people in Europe. Food prices have gone through the roof, energy prices have gone through the roof. And instead of helping their populations out, these governments are just ramping up their military expenditure, not to mention, providing extraordinary amounts of money and extraordinary numbers of weapons to Ukraine. And, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs spokesperson Zhao Lijian said it a couple of days ago. He's like, this conflict in Russia, between Russia and Ukraine, it's taken this heavy toll in Europe, but the US is benefiting from it. He's like, you've got the US arms dealers popping champagne and the energy industry making exorbitant profits. Like cutting out Russian natural gas in Europe, that's a disaster economically, and it's also a disaster environmentally. Germany's bringing its coal mines back on stream. Coal emits at least twice as much carbon dioxide as natural gas does. Meanwhile, you've got US fracking companies. They're ramping up their production of shale gas, which is something that Biden incidentally promised that he'd crack down on, and then transporting it. You have to transport natural gas. You have to liquefy it. You need to store it at minus 80 degrees centigrade or something like that. You can just imagine the environmental cost of that process, and then transporting it over the Atlantic. So much for Biden being the climate president. So you have got yes, you've got this divergence, and you've got the positive side of it that we'll talk about a bit more shortly, which is like global South unity, developing world unity, non-aligned unity. We've got I would argue an inevitable trajectory towards multipolarity. But on the other hand, the US has been able to strengthen its hand somewhat with consolidating this alliance that includes basically all of Western Europe and all of the kind of the Anglosphere.
Yeah, and it's predictable too, because despite the G7's attempts to invest, or they say they're going to invest 600 billion in some kind of Western-led Belt and Road, some kind of Western-led infrastructure. We know the trend over the last 2.5 generations, and that is any kind of most of this investment generally just ends up in the hands of big financial monopolies, big contractors of some kind, and they do what they want with it, which is usually not much, or that money just is not at all, these promises are not at all implemented. This is not the first time that the United States or US-led institution has made promises to compete with China in this kind of way. This has happened throughout the Biden administration. The whole Biden administration has been, we're going to outcompete China by reinvesting at home. And workers and poor people in the United States are looking around saying, well, couldn't even get the Build Back Better legislation, which had all of the, even just the modest environmental infrastructure development measures. That's not going anywhere. And the Biden administration seems pretty fine with that, to be honest. So we know that despite all of this, it was pretty predictable that the United States, that NATO, given the current situation globally, I mean, Russia's special military operation changed everything, of course, because it was the first time in this new Cold War where there really was this kind of breaking point that occurred. And NATO has attempted, the United States and NATO have attempted to use it, to exploit it for its benefit, because they provoked the damn thing. So of course they're going to exploit it for their benefit. So it's pretty predictable, I think, also because with these divergent paths, if you have nothing to offer economically to the world, especially to countries that have these decades, if not centuries long histories of having adverse relationships with the West, with imperialism, then you're going to have to find ways to maintain hegemony through other means, right? So if you can't hold countries down with economic war primarily, then you're also going to have to build up the so-called national security state, or in this case, the global security state, because that's really what NATO is. It's a global police state. It's all about enforcing U.S. interests through a so-called military alliance. But all these European countries, and you mentioned Germany, but all of them are really just going along with the United States' geopolitical interests, and so it was predictable, I think, that given the global situation, given China's path, given the attractiveness. I mean, China just has so much to offer to Latin America, to the African continent, to all of Eurasia for that matter, including Western Europe. I mean, you live in the UK, you know that the UK is missing out on a lot because it decided to follow the United States down the tech war, down the trade war path. So, I mean, it was predictable, but I think it's important to talk about. You mentioned how there's another side to this. It's not just NATO is belligerent and it's escalating. It's escalating because of something, and it's because of a more positive trend that's happening around the world that I don't think people in the West and the United States pay enough attention to. That there is this misconception that China and Russia, to a large extent, that their activities, that their relations with the world are problematic, either just as problematic, or dare I say, there are some who believe they're more problematic, ridiculous in my view. I don't know what reality these people live in, but there is a sort of a strong anti-China and anti-Russia sentiment, which says that, okay, well, NATO's bad, but China and Russia, there's not much hope there. But I think that most of the world would differ. I think most of the world is understanding that there are profound opportunities in going along with a path that China and Russia are leading, which is international law, peace, and development, peaceful development, the right to be able to develop your economies independently without interference from these countries politically, militarily, etc. I think that's a really attractive path, and it seems almost like a modern day struggle for self-determination that we shouldn't be ignoring, and we shouldn't be bastardizing either.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just on this so-called partnership for global infrastructure and investment, I think we should be clear that it's nothing more than a flag flying exercise. I don't think anybody, including President Biden, including, the White House staffers, including the State Department, including the European Union, think that it's anything other than that. No one's got any intention of seriously launching a Belt and Road Initiative alternative because they don't have the means to do it. China's got the finance, it's got the connections with all of these countries in the developing world, the places that need this infrastructure. It's got incredible experience that it's built up over the course of decades, first with building out its own infrastructure and then building out infrastructure, particularly in Central Asia and Southeast Asia, and now Africa and Latin America and the Caribbean. The US, as I commented on social media, like the US can barely keep the lights on at home. You and I in 2019, we met up in New York City, and we also saw each other in Beijing. And the contrast between those two cities in terms of infrastructure, in terms of just how well maintained and how modern and how well organized they are, it couldn't be starker. New York is a wonderful city, don't get me wrong, but it's falling to pieces.
And you came to East Harlem too, which is one of the most, because I was working at the time when you came to see me, and East Harlem is its own, it's just one of many parts of New York City that are just so exemplary of the very trend that you're talking about, the complete and utter devastation of the infrastructure and of really where poor and working class people live.
Yeah, exactly. So if the US can't maintain, if the US can't build some decent roads and build some train networks at home, are you telling me that it's going to build high-speed rail links and renewable energy infrastructure across Asia and Africa and the Middle East and Latin America and the Caribbean? You're having a laugh, and everybody knows that. The countries of the global South know that. The countries of the global North know that. It's just a box checking exercise. It's a thing that we have to say. So it's just propaganda. It's anti-China propaganda. It's just a way of saying, don't cooperate with the Chinese. They're going to involve you in a debt trap. They're not going to follow proper environmental standards, etc., etc. What happened to the Blue Dot Network? That was 3-4 years ago that they launched this great BRI alternative, the Blue Dot Network. No one's ever heard of it since. They've literally done nothing. What happened to Build Back Better World? Disappeared.